My name is Benjamin Paloff. I am Associate Professor of Slavic Languages and Literatures and of Comparative Literature at the University of Michigan and a faculty affiliate of the Frankel Center for Judaic Studies. And it is my great privilege to lead this conversation with Arun Viswanath, who is the translator of Harry Potter und der Philosopher Stein, Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, the first volume in the Harry Potter series. I can say that this is the longest book I myself have ever read in Yiddish from cover to cover. I read it very quickly, very carefully, I should say. It wasn't so quick because I was reading it quite carefully. It is a translational masterpiece, fantastically well done. And it is an enormous pleasure to be able to speak with Arun and to welcome him virtually to the University of Michigan. The thing that people should understand about reading this book in Yiddish is that it matches the language of the English, which varies a great deal with different characters speaking in different accents and different dialects and passages in verse. And I think the way we're going to begin this conversation is Arun is going to introduce and read one of his favorite passages that reflects the musicality of the English language text in its Yiddish incarnation.
Thank you so much, Ben. And thank you, Professor Jeffrey Weidlinger, for inviting me and for hosting us for this event. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to be starting off by reading this lead from the Sortierhut, the Song of the Sorting Hat, which is in chapter 7 of the first book. I'll be reading one stanza in English, one stanza in Yiddish, and so on. But before I do that, I'll just give you a heads up of 4 words that you should keep your ears open for. And those are the 4 names of the Hogwarts houses. For those of you who have not read the Harry Potter books, when a student matriculates at the Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, they're sorted into one of 4 houses, dormitories, by a magical hat. And the names of those houses are Gryffindor, which in Yiddish is Golden Griff, Ravenclaw, Robbenkrell, Hufflepuff, and Slytherin, which in my translation is Samderin, which means poison therein. I couldn't figure out how else to make the Slither pun work. So keep your eyes out for that, and when it comes time for your house, feel free to give a silent cheer. So again, one verse in English, and then one in Yiddish. Oh, you may not think I'm pretty, but don't judge on what you see. I'll eat myself if you can find a smarter hat than me. Es ist mein Punim nicht kin Schönheit, nur de Schönheit gar nicht sagt. Geh gefinn mir noch a Hittel, was a Kopf wie meins vermogt. You can keep your bowlers black, your top hats sleek and tall, for I'm the Hogwarts sorting hat, and I can cap them all. Sorry, lost my place. Hey, die Kepke Kitschme Kapelitsch, die Streimeläusgepitzter, seid schon Meuchel, ich bin das der Samek Kimtzenitzter. There's nothing hidden in your head the sorting hat can't see. So try me on, and I will tell you where you ought to be. Der Hogwarter Sortierhut weist dein Ätzem in dein Kern. To mest mich on in Herr Mevinus, wem die tiest gehören. You might belong in Gryffindor, where dwell the brave at heart. Their daring, nerve, and chivalry set Gryffindors apart. Zu Golden Griff gehören die mit Herz galant und dreist. Sie teilen sich aus mit Gwure, oder was Gwure heißt. You might belong in Hufflepuff, where they are just and loyal. Those patient Hufflepuffs are true and unafraid of toil. Gehärst die wieder Hufflepuff, dem Joischer halts de Teier, meits ne stois de Horevanje in beständig a Getreier. Or yet in wise old Ravenclaw, if you've a ready mind, where those of wit and learning will always find their kind. Beschert zu sein in Robbenkrell is der mit scharfen Sinnen, wie Unhängers von Wissen in von Klügschaft sich gefinnen. Or perhaps in Slytherin you'll make your real friends. Those cunning folk use any means to achieve their ends. Sie efter treffst die echte Freund in Sanderen dem Chitteren, wie bei dem Ziel der Griechen seinen Kuscher alle Mitteln. So put me on, don't be afraid, and don't get in a flap. You're in safe hands, though I have none, for I'm a thinking cap. To tu mich an it, schreck sich nicht, ich leg auf dir kein Hand. Ich bin fort bloß a Sortierhut, gur a freundlich Stück Gewand. And of course, I should say I'm a Ravenclaw.
Oh, that's a wonderful passage, and it really does capture the attention to the language itself and to the rhythm and rhyme of the language. And before we get into that, because I have lots of questions about that, in fact, but I wanted to note for the audience that there's a Q&A option within this webinar. So if you do have a question for Arun, please just drop it into the Q&A. We'll both be monitoring it, and we're going to switch in about 20-25 minutes from talking among ourselves to feeding some of those questions to Arun, so that you can get some of your own questions answered. I wanted to invite Arun initially, after that wonderful reading, to just give us a little background on how this project happened. It is for those in attendance who are not aware, this is an extraordinarily successful translation, far more successful than in terms of sales and reception than a lot of translations of literary texts simply into English. I myself was lucky enough to get one of the second printings, because I had waited until 48 hours after the book went on sale. And within those 48 hours, the first printing of, I think, 1,000 copies had sold out. So I snagged the second printing, and as I understand it, it is already in its third. So how did this project happen?
I grew up in the small but scattered community of Yiddishists worldwide. Yiddishists meaning not in the narrow academic sense, but people who believe that Yiddish is an important language for Ashkenazi Jews, and it's important to continue to use it. So Yiddish was actually one of my first languages. I grew up speaking Yiddish with my mother and my sisters and my cousins, and of course my grandparents. So growing up, I think I really felt the acute lack of Yiddish language reading material that seemed matched to what a kid like me wanted to read growing up in the suburbs of New York City. And I wish that I could have appreciated Yiddish literature, not just the classic Yiddish literature of Shalom Aleichem and Peretz, but even the Yiddish language children's literature, which was really starting to develop as a distinct genre, and which has recently been published in a wonderful anthology by Professor Miriam Udell. But those just didn't really speak to me. And the more contemporary Hasidic children's literature did have the gloss and the colors, but it was often a bit more explicitly moralizing and a bit narrower in terms of the themes that it covered. So I always wanted to have something like Harry Potter in Yiddish. And it really wasn't until about 5 years ago when I was discussing the future with my wife, and she asked me if I was really considering raising children in Yiddish without a world that has Yiddish Harry Potter. And so I took the challenge seriously, and 3 years later, Yiddish Harry Potter was out in the world. So it was it was not planned, but once it got underway, it took on a life of its own.
Well, so let me kind of jump on to something you just said about the, wanting to read something that felt more contemporary, which is actually one of the reasons I turned to the book as someone who's a latecomer to Yiddish. I only started learning Yiddish a few years ago, but most of what I was reading was material from the pre-war period. And I wanted to read something that had DVD players and microwave ovens and things like stuff that seems casually familiar. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit how you approached just writing the language for things that might not have easy lexical equivalents in Yiddish already. Not just, obviously there are, we have Yiddish words for microwave and television, that sort of thing, but we don't have Yiddish words for half the stuff they refer to in Harry Potter, because these were words that were invented or adapted for that particular story world.
Yes, I think there's tremendous irony when you consider that Yiddish literature is largely based on a world that was a real world that many of our ancestors came from, and yet for many of us, Harry Potter is somehow a fantasy world, which obviously never existed, feels closer somehow than the shtetl itself, and how Harry Potter in Yiddish translation can, for I think some students of Yiddish, be a more natural entry point into the world of what I call true Yiddish literature. I would not pretend to compare my translation of Harry Potter into Yiddish with the venerable body of Yiddish literature, which really matches in terms of its quality many world-class literatures. But yeah, to answer your question, there were certainly a number of terms which did require a little bit of creativity. My broad approach was, in 3 words, do no harm. If the term is a term that has no apparent meaning, or it's a term that is so entrenched in the minds of readers who just want to read Harry Potter in Yiddish, they don't want to read fan fiction, leave those alone as much as possible. So I know this is not what you're asking about, but I didn't want to change Harry to Herschel, or Hermione to Hannah, or even Sirius Black to Sirius Schwartz, because that would kind of turn him. Have you ever met a non-Jew named Schwartz? Schwartz is obviously a Jew. So I tried to leave as many things intact as possible. But of course, there are certain terms which are net new to the world and which are based on some obvious piece of wordplay. So I already mentioned Samderin as a translation for Slytherin, but that's not even a magical object. So take, for example, the Golden Snitch. So that, I think for many of us who grew up with Harry Potter, the Golden Snitch doesn't sound strange to our ears, but once I started thinking about it, I thought it was odd symbolism indeed. A snitch for me, doesn't have positive connotations, but it represents the object in my mind, and I hadn't thought too much about the word itself. So when it came to translating it into Yiddish, I couldn't just take the Yiddish word for snitch, for example, moiser, and turn that and just import that into the translation. So in those cases, I did have to get a little bit more creative and think a little bit more about what the object represents and whether there's a natural way to translate it, and if there is a naturally Jewish way, or some sort of, I think of it as like a neutral Jewish character that I can impart to it. And the thing that eventually came to me was that the Golden Snitch, I should mention for those who aren't familiar with it, is one of the 3 balls that is used in the magical sport of Quidditch. It is a small golden ball with silver wings. And I thought, what better image than the butterfly, which for me, growing up in a number of children's songs, songs by Itzik Manger, the butterfly looms large. There's, of course, a well-known poem which from the Holocaust about a butterfly. And so I felt like that encompassed a real elegance and beauty. And so I called the golden snitch, this golden flatterel, the golden butterfly. So it's hard to give a general approach for everyone because everyone is so unique, but that would be one example.
Did you find yourself at all influenced, I suppose, as you were doing this translation by, because you said you don't want to do any violence to the text or change things that didn't really call for it. But in reading it, it was still, for me, oddly difficult not to hear the characters in the voices of the actors from the movie. So even though, like, I mean, when I was reading, you're reading Hagrid's, played wonderfully by Robbie Coltrane in the films, I hear it as sort of like, Harry, du bist a Kiesjesmacher, it's like, it's still in this kind of like voice of him. Did that influence you as you were thinking about the language?
It's definitely difficult to disentangle the voices and the mannerisms of the actors. Quite felicitously, I came to the realization that a subtle way to make the text feel natural in Yiddish without explicitly Judaizing the characters was to make use of the variety of Yiddish dialects and registers that exist in Yiddish today, or which have traditionally existed in Yiddish, and which have come down to us perhaps in the form of caricature. The caricature of the Litvak, of the sort of the stern, strict, buttoned up person of Northeastern Europe, those who say Kugel and Shane Mädel, as opposed to the Galicianer, the warm, effusive, perhaps sometimes fumbling person of Poland and further south, who would say Shine Mädel and Kegel. And it seemed to me to match up really perfectly to have somebody like Professor McGonagall or Professor Snape use actual Litvish grammar and vocabulary, so right of Northeastern Yiddish, and have Hagrid with his sort of gravelly, warm voice speaking with a typical Galicianer usage, and of course I couldn't help but impart to Dumbledore a certain scholarly language. So he skews more heavily towards Hebrew and Aramaic usages, which are known in Yiddish, but which certainly belong to the learned register. And so it was actually a very convenient way to retain what felt to me to be an essential part of the text, which really came from the movies, and to kind of map that onto the Yiddish scape.
And I can say, by the way, that comes out very powerfully in the translation and very usefully for a learner of Yiddish, where most of what one would read, will be Klaussprach, would be this, very, the textbook stuff. And you don't necessarily, you might read about dialect, but you won't necessarily get a good flavor for it and how it's represented in a text. This comes out very, very strongly in the translation, and very usefully. So I really want to congratulate you on that. It's really extremely well done.
Thank you. And I should mention, I'm just dropping a link right now in the chat for everybody. If you want to take a look later, I think this really epitomizes what Ben was saying. I did a recording of the first chapter. It's not very high quality in terms of the audio, but you can kind of hear, even if you don't know any Yiddish, you'll immediately be able to hear when Hagrid starts talking, or when Dumbledore starts talking, or McGonagall starts talking. So it's just chapter 1. Hopefully we will have a full audiobook at some point.
Well, that it kind of makes me want to jump to something I wanted to ask toward the end, but I'm going to ask it now because it's on my mind. I finished reading this book several months ago. what's the future of the project? Like, are you actively working on the next volume? You know, you've unleashed a monster.
Yes, I'm afraid that I've bitten off quite a big chunk. Well, the first thing I'll say is the reason, the proximal reason for undertaking this translation, my future progeny has arrived, and so my free time, thank you, is significantly reduced. But I am at work on the second book. Hopefully that is something that we get to see relatively soon. And I think after the second book is out, God willing, as we say, as Gott wird geben Koyach and Zeit, if God will give energy and time, we will have an audiobook of the first book, hopefully by a professional voice actor and not by me. But the challenge, of course, with these books is that they get longer and longer and longer, such that once you get to, you know, the fourth book, it's something like 2 or 3 times as long as the first one. So if the first one took me 3 years, let's say we shave off 1 year for the amount of time it took me to get used to her style. That's still quite a bit of time. And of course, another thing to note is that the style really matures, and the complexity of the vocabulary and of the prose really matures. And just like the first book for Rowling was in many ways her first attempt at this genre, at this type of literature, this was my first stab at Yiddish translation in any serious sense. And so I fear that the slope may get steeper and steeper as I continue forward. So I hope that we will be able to see at least a second book in the near future, and then hopefully a third book, but all 7 may perhaps be a project beyond the span of my life. We'll see.
Well, I certainly look forward to more of it. It's so well done. You answered some of these, sort of responded to some of these questions already, referring to the Jewishness of the text and the Jewish, I mean, which is obvious, right? It's in Yiddish. It's going to be a Jewish text, and something you and I have spoken about at another time that that is persistently on my mind in approaching the Yiddish language text is how the Jewishness of the language is inevitable. And you feel it as you're reading it, and yet the world that Rowling has created here seems entirely devoid of Jewishness, of Jewish identity, of Jewish holidays, of any reference to even potential Jewishness, with the one exception, which in some ways makes it even starker, of this character, Anthony Goldstein, who's only ever mentioned as basically a social footnote. He doesn't speak, he doesn't act, he's not party. He's just kind of dropped in passing in a couple of passages over the span of this long series. Whereas, you know, dragons, magic, wizardry, that's part of this world. Jews are more fantastical in some ways. And at the same time, there are some representations in the series, for example, the goblins, who are the bankers in the wizarding world, that suggest pretty strong, potentially, arguably anti-Semitic stereotypes. So I've really been curious. I was very curious as I was reading it, and I'm just endlessly fascinated by how you experience that as you're translating this series and what you make of it.
Ooh, that's a real doozy. Okay, I'll try to. So the first thing I'll say is, while today we may associate the Yiddish language with, at least in modern day, with Hasidim, and as we project backwards, we may associate it with the traditional Jews of the shtetl. The movement of Yiddishism was largely a secular, at least an a-religious movement, with some exceptions. And so there is quite a bit of Yiddish literature that is written in Yiddish, which is entirely devoid of any sort of religious content, and yet you can still see in it usages, those that come from Hebrew and Aramaic, sometimes which explicitly, ironically, are winking at the textual tradition of Hebrew and Aramaic. And so in that sense, I guess what I'm trying to say is that it is possible to strike a religiously neutral tone, even as you're employing language which may be reminiscent of the religious lifestyle, or really be rooted in that. And I tried to I tried to hold myself back as much as possible, but there are certain turns of phrase in Yiddish which you really can't avoid. So, for example, if you're talking in Yiddish about something that you really don't want to happen, you're going to say Chalila. So, whereas in English, we might use Chalila simply as an introduction, Chalila, chas v'chalila. In Yiddish, you would use it almost as a particle within a sentence, unstressed, right? So you would say, "Ken Chalila fam," I might fall, and hurt myself. And so those are the kinds of usages which even characters who are, Hermione is crossing all of her fingers as she's looking into the sky while Harry is playing Quidditch, or Ron, who is praying with all of his might, and I'm quite sure it's not a Jewish prayer, that a troll is not going to be coming out towards him. They are still speaking in some way which is quintessentially Jewish. In terms of the goblins, it's certainly a sensitive issue. But I think what I would say is that just as with other fantasy novels, the entire universe of Harry Potter is built on the Western European tradition of folktale and mythology, with its frequently encountered creatures that are, whether it's the goblin or the dwarf, which live underground and produce gold and zealously guard their treasures. This is not a caricature which is unique to Harry Potter. And I think the most that one could say is that Rowling is building off of these established references within the genre. And I think it's easy to problematize the entire genre. One would note that Tolkien himself explicitly identified dwarves with Jews. But in his opinion, it was not at all an unsympathetic depiction. He actually really admired them. And I think that while the initial impression that one might get of goblins in Harry Potter is that they're not sympathetic, I think that as you read further in the books, you start to get a real three-dimensional picture of this of this oppressed underclass, which doesn't really track with what one might expect of an anti-Semitic caricature. They're unwaveringly loyal. They're filled with a fierce sense of justice. They're unafraid to engage in armed resistance over the course of centuries, or express open scorn for their oppressors. So I think there's certainly something there that Rowling is building on. But I actually find myself admiring the goblins in many ways. One small thing that I will add is that I found one opportunity to engage with this impression that some readers might get by having the goblins address the wizards with the term Odin or Adoin, Adon, as some may recognize the word, which literally means master, and is a word which one frequently encounters in Yiddish usage, in older Yiddish literature, that is employed by Jews when speaking to or referring to non-Jewish wielders of power. So whether it's the governor or the Puritz, the rich landowner. So I do think that it's impossible to not see some Jewishness in them, but I don't think that it needs to be negative. And in fact, one might argue that the much more salient Jewishness comes out when comparing the wizards to the broader world of humans. This is a group of people that has a frequently misunderstood and therefore hidden away tradition. And my father-in-law, who grew up in Basel, he tells me that when he finished reading the Harry Potter books, he said, "How did J.K. Rowling know what it was like to grow up Jewish in Switzerland?" And so I think it can really go both ways.
That's great. That's fantastic. Well, it might be a good actually time to pivot into addressing some of the questions that are starting to show up. And again, if anyone in attendance wishes to have us address a question about this translation or about translating English literature into Yiddish, please just drop your question into the Q&A, and we'll both be monitoring it. I may collate some of your questions so that we can get to them in the 25 or so minutes remaining in this event. But one of the first questions that came in was specifically about this something translators always get is how much say does the author have in how this is rendered. I noted at the very top of the hour that this book in Yiddish is called Harry Potter und der Philosophische Stein. It says Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, and the Sorcerer's Stone, which is how it's known in North America. It has a slightly different title in the UK in its first edition, and you're basing your translation on that, as I understand, right? And so what how was the decision made to choose that, and what other, say, insistences did Rowling or her, one assumes, army of of representatives, how much did they say determine some of the choices that you were making as a translator?
For the most part, there was little direct cooperation with Rowling or her team. Of course, they had to approve the translation, but I doubt that they actually had anybody reviewing the translation. They did ask that we not change the names of any major characters, which I didn't want to do anyway. The choice of Harry Potter and der Philosophische Stein, which literally is "and the philosophical stone." Some might wonder why do that? Why not dem Philosophstein or something like that? As a matter of fact, although this is a mythical object, the Philosopher's Stone, it is an object which is a central part of the thread of alchemy that extends out from the Middle Ages, and this has been written about in Yiddish, and so it's been referred to with many terms. One in more religious texts is called the Even HaChachamim, which perhaps for obvious reasons, for those of you who have seen or who have read the Hebrew translation will understand why I couldn't go with that one. The title is indeed Harry Potter ve'Even HaChachamim. So the other appellation which I came across was Harry Potter and the Philosophische Stein. And so that seemed like the right way to go. There were moments that for the first month or so when I was working on the translation, I'm ashamed to say that I was working off of a US printing. And I had not realized that there were some details that had been changed from the British version. And so after that, I said, "Genig," and I went back to the original, and I said, I'm never again veering away from the straight path.
So you went back to the canon, as it were.
Indeed.
Well, so there are a couple of questions that have come in really about how you approach the language itself. One is a very specific question that I know as a translator, I can't always recall the solution I came up with. There's a lot of punning and kind of word games, not necessarily paranomasia. There's plenty of that too, but there's Voldemort's name, for example, is an anagram, right? And then there was the question of dialect that I thought was a very clever solution to the different dialects that are spoken of English that are represented in the English language text. So this is kind of a two-part question. How did you approach the anagram of Voldemort's name, right? Which anagrams to Tom Riddle, who's the Anakin Skywalker to Darth Vader, right? He's the earlier version, the first edition. And then how did you, what dialect of Yiddish did you choose for the narrative text, the text that is not dialogue within the book?
Okay, that's a great question. In terms of the anagram, one of the curious things about he who shall not be named, Lord Voldemort, is it's unclear how the name should be pronounced. Is it Voldemort or is it Voldemort? Right? Are you going with the French pronunciation? And if you ask the author, well, it's more of a do as I say, not as I do, because she is on tape saying Voldemort, and yet she has said that it should be pronounced Voldemort. So I had a little bit of latitude in which spelling I was going to use, which is of course quite important when determining what the anagram is going to look like, because that either takes away a letter that I'm going to use or adds it back in. Some translations have done the most brilliant things. I'm trying to remember, one of the Scandinavian languages takes ego sum Voldemort and turns it into something fantastic. The French translation also does an amazing job completely recasting Voldemort's name as Je du sort. I didn't want to go that far, so I, like many other translations, I can't tell you what my solution is yet. You'll have to wait for the second book for that. But
yeah, that's in Chamber of Secrets, right, where they
yes,
they anagram it out.
But like many other translations, I am probably going to fiddle around with Tom Riddle's middle name, which will give me a little bit of latitude. In terms of the dialects, I should also mention that there's really only one person in the original, at least in the first book, who explicitly, or only one major character who explicitly is speaking in dialect, and that's Hagrid. You immediately see it from all the apostrophes. It's clear that he's using some sort of West Country accent. And for the other characters, I think basically what happened was I was already looking for subtle ways to make the text feel naturally Yiddish. And once I settled on Hagrid speaking a dialect, it was so obvious that he was going to be a Galicianan. He's going to be a Galicianan. You need a Litvak to balance him out. And Snape and McGonagall and who is the other Litvak? Filch. I mean, they're just the perfect foils in a number of interesting ways. And once you do that, and it kind of cascaded from there. I had to be a little careful not to go overboard, but I tried to really strike a balance between rendering them in sort of Yiddish Jewish Technicolor and remaining loyal to the way the characters are described in the original. And for everything else, I mean, I wouldn't say that there is an explicitly neutral dialect in Yiddish. There have been various standards proposed, aside from the reigning one today in Yiddish spheres, which is based on the Litvish dialect. But what's great about written Yiddish is that you can't really tell what dialect something is written in if you're not using explicitly dialectal forms. And so, Ben, you might be reading the text and reading it in Yivo Yiddish pronunciation, but for those of you who will go over to YouTube and check out that reading, you'll see that I'm reading the neutral narration in my native Ukrainian dialect. And so that's what's great about written Yiddish, is that you can kind of interpret it however you want. But when it came to those specific characters, I tried to use some explicit markers of dialect, like apostrophes to mark abbreviation or nasalization, or explicit words, which are really only used by speakers of certain dialects to indicate begin dialect here, end dialect here.
I have to admit that every time Dumbledore spoke, and it was an advantage that in this particular volume, he becomes, of course, much more prominent in later volumes, but in the first volume, he's kind of he's almost a mysterious figure. He's never around, right? He's kind of like, he's in his tower. But every time he shows up, particularly later in the book, there was a lot of dictionary time. Because you really do pepper his language with with fairly esoteric vocabulary. It was an education. Speaking of which, in fact, one of the questions that's come in from the audience is whether you encountered any concepts, ideas, or even just turns of phrase that you kind of thought were untranslatable, or on the flip side of that, whether you found at any point that there were things that you could do that would capture a flavor of the original without necessarily being quite. So you said that you didn't want to break it. You didn't want to do something entirely new, but every once in a while, that may seem that in fact may be the lesser of two evils.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the vast majority of words that are employed you can typically break them down into some sort of sound symbolism. I recall there was one word which I couldn't figure out what the word was made up of, and that's Quidditch, or the name of the most popular sport in the wizarding world, indeed, followed by gobstones. So how does one translate Quidditch? Of course, some readers would argue, well, why not just call it Quidditch? And that's certainly doable. I don't know if this is what the asker of the question meant by untranslatable, but in a sort of very technical sense, you can't really translate a word which is gibberish. So I was considering leaving it alone, but then I recalled that there is this wonderful saying in Yiddish, which for the Yiddish speakers here, as well as for the Hebrew speakers, you'll know this term, you'll know this phrase. In Yiddish, one says, "As Gott will schießt der Besen." If God wills it, even a broom can shoot or bloom, perhaps. In Hebrew, it's "Kshelokim rotzeh gam et ha'teoreh." And that phrase really stuck out in my mind as I was working on these various Quidditch passages with people flying around on brooms, and it only occurred to me relatively later on that I could take the words in that phrase and kind of smush them together to get schießbesen, which literally means shoot broom, and that's how Quidditch became schießbesen. But for the most part, I think a lot of the other terms were more or less transparent in terms of the sound symbolism or the root words, and there are certainly those that are trickier to translate well, but that's the one that sticks out as untranslatable. In terms of you mentioned a lot of dictionary use. I included a glossary on the website, on the publisher's website. By the way, I'm dropping a link for anybody who's interested in buying the book. That's harrypotter.olniansky.com. If you go there, there's a tab on the top for glossary. So there's words that are included there, but only words that you will not find either in their compound form or they're in their component form in Bainfeld and Bachner's Comprehensive Yiddish English Dictionary. So I tried to make the book as student-friendly as possible. And one more thing I should mention, I said that the reason why I did this was kind of selfish, for myself and for my future children and, for my past child self. But I also found that in today's modern Yiddishist world, students and even longtime speakers of Yiddish, we tend to gravitate towards trends of phrase which most naturally and easily, conveniently map on to our native tongue. And so one often gets the sense that we are more often than not speaking English translated into Yiddish. And you can read classic Yiddish literature to get a sense for what that turn of phrase is, but because I think the setting of those 100 years ago or more, and even the way that one might translate those into English would seem so unnatural to a modern speaker of English, I wanted to give people a resource and show them that there are very natural Yiddish native ways to express terms that a teenager might use in a wizarding school, and that and really challenge speakers or students and even longtime speakers to continue to develop their vocabulary. I learned a ton of Yiddish while working on this translation. And I think that is the common thread among all Yiddish students and speakers today, is that we can all improve in terms of our idiom and in terms of our grammar even. So.
And to echo that, because I'm sure we have some Yiddish, some students of Yiddish from the university in the audience. As I said, I picked the book up in part because I wanted to read something contemporary, because I wanted to quicken my reading fluency. So I know that some younger students might feel intimidated to pick up a 300-some page book to, for a language they've been studying for a couple of years. It just happens fortuitously that English language syntax and Yiddish language syntax are extremely close together. And you will be reading them, you will be reading quite fluidly rather quickly. And so like Shizbazem, for example, was something like, it stopped seeming weird after 2 pages. It's just because Quidditch is a weird word too. That becomes what it's called. It's really a very effective pedagogical tool, and I've been kind of needling some of my colleagues at the university. Because I kept a vocabulary list of my own, we can build a course around this. It's really very, very, very much worthwhile to pick this up. On the more difficult side, we did have a question from an audience member about whether you had any particular notable examples of Dumbledorian yeshivish.
Yeah, when Harry is coming back to visit the mirror of Erised, he walks into the room and doesn't notice that Dumbledore is there. And Dumbledore says to Harry, hold on a second. Sometimes those who become invisible, their own vision becomes weaker. I really butchered the original there. But I had him say in the translation that a roya ve'eno nira sometimes will end up having reduced ria. So somebody who sees but is not seen will have a reduced sense of sight. So those are all terms, of course, borrowed from Hebrew. So I will note that while some of these terms may seem arcane, as you note, so many of us who are children of the 90s, or really just if you're a human alive today, and you grew up hearing this text, and you might even know much of it by heart. Don't be afraid to dive into this Yiddish text and even have the English side by side. Like Ben says, I think that you will very quickly see that even though it's really not a beginner's text, if you know the original well, you will be reading quite fluently in no time.
I have to, I'll admit that my one worry as we get further into the series is what my wife would refer to as the interminable Quidditch matches. There is quite a bit of Quidditch later in the book, or later in the series, but this novel reads so fluidly. And another member of our audience has asked whether you could speak a little bit more about the attendee is referring to the Kabbalistic power of words, kind of world creation through language. And as you're translating, this is always my experience in translating a book. The first half is slow. The first half is you learning the project. The text is teaching you how to translate it. But the second half is a little bit more like spell casting. You've learned the lessons, you've made the decisions, you've figured out Shizbazem, that sort of thing, right? At what point did you find that you're just kind of, you're in Harry Potter's world and you're making that world through another language?
This is probably less interesting for the audience, but there was certainly a point as I was working on the translation where I found myself thinking about Harry Potter, not related to the translation, and hearing the Yiddish word in my head and not the English word. So that was certainly exciting. I think there's certainly something to be said for the what I think of as almost the closed bubble of the Harry Potter universe, and how for many of us it might be difficult to square what we have experienced as really inspiring characters and plot with some of the political viewpoints espoused by the author. There is certainly something about Harry Potter standing on its own and being a universe that we can visit. And again, the irony of something fantastical feeling so close to us when perhaps, again, for many of us, our own not so distant past might feel much further. I think there's something really magical about being able to inhabit that in Yiddish, to have that magic in Yiddish. That's, I think there is something very comforting to me with all the caveats about this not being what I think of as true Yiddish literature. But there's something really magical about being able to inhabit that universe in what for me is my native tongue, and for many of us is our ancestral tongue. I think there's really something magical about that. I don't know anything about Kabbalah though, so perhaps our audience member could look more into that.
No, but I like that response very much. There are a couple of people in the audience have actually asked about Rowling's transphobia and some of the things she's said that have certainly troubled many of us, should trouble all of us, and have potentially can sour some of the experience of what is really a wonderful children's book. And you and I talked about this in the past, but I kind of wonder if Teddy allows, in a sense, that it's no longer hers. It now becomes something else. It becomes our book. The book for those who can read it in this new language, and thanks to you. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose there is an aspect of through translating it into something else, it both creates closeness to those of us who are carriers of the legacy of Ashkenazi Judaism and of Yiddish, while at the same time distancing it from its source. I wouldn't make any sort of essentialist claim here, because I think that there are many who are deeply troubled by Rowling's transphobia, and at the same time are still able to enjoy the books and say, no, I'm going to reclaim this. But I think there's certainly an aspect in which through the simultaneous distancing and bringing closer of the act of translation and transposing the characters and the plot into the world of Yiddish, or perhaps the other way around, it allows us to see it through a new lens, perhaps free of associations with the author.
Yeah, I'm perhaps too in some ways too biased in this, but I generally feel that there's no reason why a translated text is a shadow of an original. I think that it is its own literature unto itself. And you keep saying, you've said a couple of times, well, this is not like real Yiddish literature. I respectfully disagree. I think that this is a wonderful text written in Yiddish and really worth engaging as a Yiddish language text. Just a couple other, we have time for just one or two more questions, and Professor Maya Barzilai is asking whether the gender marking of Yiddish nouns and pronouns caused any challenges in doing the translation.
That's a good question. I can definitely think of places where I actively employed nominal gender markings. Professor McGonagall in Yiddish is Professorsche McGonagall, whereas, I don't know, Professor Dumbledore is just Professor Dumbledore. I'm trying to think. I don't think there were really very many places where gender neutrality was particularly called for. There is an increasing tendency among the Yiddishist community outside of the Hasidic community, which of course constitutes the bulk of Yiddish speakers today. But there is a growing trend of employing they as a gender neutral pronoun. Mm-hmm. But that's not typically how Yiddish has dealt with a sort of unspecified person off to the side. Typically, just masculine pronouns are used, as with many other languages. But perhaps we'll continue to see that shift or for that to take hold.
Okay. Well, we are just about, I think, out of time. It's been a wonderful conversation. There were about 60 or so people in attendance in this last hour. This conversation is being recorded and will be archived and available on the Frankel Center's website shortly. For those of you who want to either refer back or send a link, please do share this and other videos that are available on the site. And to the extent that the technology will allow, this is what I would normally say if we were meeting in person, is please join me in thanking Arun Viswanath for this wonderful conversation about what is truly a wonderful Yiddish language text. So
thank you so much, Ben. Thank you so much. And I should say, it would be my dream to see a Yiddish course in a university employing the translation. I do think that it's an amazing learner's tool. And another appeal to the audience, you should definitely buy the book. I am certainly not making much of any kind of royalties from the book, and neither is Rolling. So you're really supporting a publisher of Yiddish books who is, who hopefully will continue to be able to make this project possible, and hopefully future books and audiobooks. So, if you would like it, even just for your bookshelf, just to show where your loyalties lie, or for your friend, or buy it for your buddy.
And I would echo that. Onyansky Text, the publisher is based in Sweden and it is a labor of love, and they produce these beautiful books in Yiddish primarily for children. And the edition that they've produced of Harry Potter is a beautiful hardcover edition, very much worth having as an object in your home. There it is, with illustrations, and it really is beautifully done. So I highly recommend this. One of the best book purchases I've made in the last year. Thank you so much, Arun, and be well, and thank you everyone who was able to attend this gathering.
Thank you so much. Take care.